I am joined by James Elder, Head of Clinical Practice for Atrium HR. He's over in the UK, just outside London. James, how are you today?
Very well indeed. It's a beautiful sunny day here in London.
Fantastic. And tell us a bit about what you do then as Head of Clinical Practice. What does that mean?
Well, I'm a practicing therapist. I work as a therapist primarily. I'm also the coordinator of all our recruitment of therapists for the EAP services. I also teach therapists for University of Greenwich, so I have a very good understanding of what makes a good therapist and what doesn't.
As HR, a few of us are experts on sort of wellness or therapy or what would be best for people. So we do need to seek third-party advice on things like this. And a lot of companies previously may have implemented EAPs, but there seems to be a lot of misconceptions about them. And often they're just like, people think they're just a hotline that people can phone and there you go, that's it, I'm done with that, that's off HR's plate then. Can you tell us a bit more about what an EAP really should be?
Yeah, I think the thing with employee assistance programs, full stop, is that they're often seen as a tick box exercise. We have to have it like health and safety. And if you make that initial error and don't get into dialogue about what the needs are, it cascades down. So we end up with not really fulfilling the needs of the employees. And we end up with something that ticks a box, but when we actually need to make the call, it's the emergency, we need to break the glass. 70% of people, of staff claim that EAPs improve their health, and people need more support than ever. So making the decision about getting the right organization in place to support your people in times of crisis is really important.
So if I am in HR and I need to up the game a bit on my EAP, what would be your advice in terms of the sort of composition of an EAP? What does a good one look like?
I think one of the key things is what you touched upon earlier on, is that it can't just be a helpline number. It has to be more than that. Part of that is around making sure that people can access it confidentially. You need what we like to call a robust wellness platform. It's really about communication. It's about communicating what the EAP can do and facilitating the line of communication between the staff and the EAP without having to spend lots of time going through HR.
Now, the problem with that communication sometimes is that, and especially out here in Asia, but to a certain extent around the world, people are very reticent about talking about mental health issues. I remember being in a room and I did this sort of test from Mind, an organization in Hong Kong that does a lot of work with mental health. And they said, put your hand up here if you've been to see a doctor for a physical illness in the last year. And about 60% of the people put their hand up. And then said, okay, put your hand up if you've been to see a doctor about a mental health issue. Nobody put their hand up. So how can you encourage people to have that conversation with HR when they kind of worry in the back of their mind, hey, if I let HR know that I've got a mental health issue, then they might sack me. They might not want me working in the organization anymore.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you've hit on something really important, is that whilst we might want support for our mental health and our well-being, we also don't want it on our CV. The stigma attached to mental health isn't a stigma around mental health itself. It's a stigma about your HR people, who are the people who hire you and fire you, knowing where your mental health is at. So a really important part of the communication is normalizing that mental health issues occur, and that actually let's stop it before it gets to the point where it is starting to be an issue in your work. Let's talk about mental health rather than mental illness. Let's start to do something about it right now. And one of the things we're finding with the millennial generation, and people forget perhaps that millennials started in 1984. So some of them are 36, 37 years old. These aren't little kids who are sitting on their mobile phones, as often portrayed by the media. These are people who are probably the main body of the workforce. And their tolerance for taking on unnecessary pain when you could solve the problem is tiny. They don't sit around waiting for taking the pain and not solving the problem. They go, okay, actually, I've got something going on. I'm going to get that sorted. Let's get it done, because they're so used to pressing a button and something happens. So So with that in mind, they will go and get mental health treatments.
I think the way that HR frames this is very important. It doesn't have to be a negative thing at all. It can be having a chat. It can be quite informal, something that's there just when you need a sounding board, rather than having to wait for a more serious iteration of mental health before you actually take the plunge and make the phone call.
Absolutely. Nobody thinks anything of sports psychologists working with premium athletes to make sure that they work at the highest level of productivity. And there's absolutely no reason why we can't apply the same kinds of approaches to people who are working in very busy lives in very difficult conditions.
Imagine everybody watching now, you've probably got several hundred people in HR watching. What would be your takeaway advice to them if they know there's challenges? I mean, I don't think there's anyone watching this who would say, no, we have no problem of mental health in our organization. There are huge challenges with it now. What would be your 20-second advice to them?
Get into dialogue with the people providing the EAP. Find out how they select their therapists. Find out if it's just lowest common denominator. Because if you get the wrong plumber, you end up with a basement full of water. If you get the wrong therapist, it impacts on every single aspect of your life. Therapy isn't just from going from terrible to okay. It's also from going just under okay to amazing. And we all need a bit of support with the things that are going on in the economic landscape right now.
I've taken a few sort of key points away from that. So it's important to have a robust EAP, but it's much more important that you make it accessible so people know it's there and know what it does. That you make it very confidential. That's very important, so that there's a trust and people are not worried about opening up. I think it's important to let the staff know that the advice they're getting from the professionals through the EAP will not be shared with the HR department. And something I learned as well, I used to think mental health is good or bad. It's not. It's a huge spectrum, and people are constantly moving somewhere along that spectrum. It's sometimes the preventative idea of sounding ideas off somebody can help stop somebody going down the wrong end of the spectrum.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time, James.